Hello everyone, I'm Stephanie Alonso and this is my midterm video on methods of execution. I'm going to be talking about the many different types of executions used thousands of years ago back in the years BC and some executions in the modern days. I'm going to be talking about how gruesome and cruel the ancient methods of execution were and the reasons why some of the people were so brutally executed. I'm also going to be touching up on how those methods have changed over time, how no longer something as simple as theft would be punishable for execution and things similar like that. Little crimes that were all executed for. Throughout history, there has been many different types of methods of execution. This varied by your culture, by your race, the time you were in. For example, now the executions now are not the executions that there were back then. And the crime the executor was serving for also varied. Thousands of years ago, executions came about when laws started forming and the people decided that there were some crimes that death was the only fair punishment to send out a message against crime and what you were going to have to go through if you broke the law in any way, apparently. So the first execution ever recorded was death by an axe, and the executed man was accused of using magic and ordered to kill himself with an axe publicly. Eventually, the people realized that the crimes and the gruesome executions were not coinciding. So the crime was not fitting the execution, and the execution were not fitting the crimes. By this, I mean that the crime would be something like theft, and you would get executed because you stole something. Therefore, people would not be executed for things that were serious and that needed that extreme kind of punishment. For example, being accused of practicing magic even if there was no proof. Another downside to the executions would be that some people would be racially biased or biased based on the person's society level. For example, if the person who was going to be executed was a noble or a person of money, it came from rich family, the judge might in secret decide to pardon the person or even make it the execution a faster kind of execution, like maybe the guillotine, which is just a quick and easy death. Not easy, but quick. Now, if the person was of color or a different culture, then this could have gone bad for them. Maybe they were going to be treated unfairly, meaning that they were going to give execution methods that were way too cruel for no reason, or for a reason, but a racial reason. Eventually, people started getting very creative with the methods of execution, and by creative, I don't mean creative in a good way. I mean creative in a cruel way. These very creative executions were boiling, flaying, death by molten metal, skinning, and many more. Thankfully, now there are other methods of execution that are less inhumane, brutal, and gruesome. For example, lethal injections. Nowadays, executions are faster, no torture. Some say no pain, at least for the lethal injection one. And throughout history, humanity has decided that these ancient executions were way too much and they were not fair or just. For anything that was against the law, you would be very brutally executed, tortured, humiliated, all of the above. It took decades for the executions to become more realistic and more merciful, but little by little, the executions became less gruesome and fair, thankfully. So these are some of the ancient executions and some of the modern ones. And the one I'm going to be touching up on is the brazen bull. So the brazen bull is one of the most inhumane and cruel executions that I found during my research. So back in the day, the brazen bull, the victim would be put into a hollow metal life-sized bowl. Firewood was then put under the bowl, and the person would be slowly burned alive. Now, aside from the burning, they decided to make the bull moo while the person screams. Now, they made this possible, and this is what I meant by literally very creative in the worst way possible. They made this possible by installing a piping system. As you can see here in the picture, that is where the body is, and the piping goes right where the person is screaming. So you can hear their screams, and then through the bull's mouth, it comes out. So not only did it make the execution very gruesome and cruel, they also made them very humiliating and turned them into entertainment. Here in this picture, you could see the little door that they used to open and put the person inside, the firewood on the bottom. And yes, this was very, very cruel. So ironically, this method of execution was invented by Perillus of Athens between the years of 570 and 554 BC, and this method was first used by its inventor, which is why I said ironically. When the Greek tyrant of Sicily, Phalaris, found out Perillus made this invention, he decided to throw Perillus inside the bowl and put the invention to test with its inventor. So as I said, back in the day, there were very cruel executions, but there was also very cruel rulers, leaders, and he decided, why not put it to the test, and you're gonna be the first one in the bowl. Another very popular ancient form of execution was crucifixion. Although crucifixion was the main part of the method of the execution method, these people would get way more torture before the actual crucifixion process. So this was by getting stripped of their clothing, getting beaten almost to death, just enough to survive. And they had to walk the streets in that condition all the way towards their destination where they knew they were going to die. Afterwards, they would be crucified, and in the crucifixion, this involved being nailed by their wrists onto a cross and being repeatedly stabbed in the side. So over here, you see two different kinds of crucifying. One was in the cross with one hand over here, one hand over here. The other one was with both arms up. So the goal wasn't for them to die from the cross itself, but for them to die from either bleeding out, starvation, dehydration, or maybe even getting like these flesh wounds eaten if they were as bad. Obviously, they were worse than in that picture, but the birds would probably come and eat their flesh probably after they were dead, while they were dying. So yeah, very, very gruesome. This was an execution of endless torture. So crucifixion was known as a penalty for rebellion, murder, rape, and theft, which I don't really believe it is a fair punishment for theft, but like I said, ancient times. The final ancient form of execution is the guillotine. This was the quickest death out of the other two that I mentioned. This was the fastest because this wooden stand you see had a blade in the middle that was held by a rope. So the executioner would let this rope go over here, and the blade would come down instantaneously and cut the person's head off. Now, there might have been some complications if you really think about it. When the blade comes down, maybe it didn't cut completely, and then they would have to, But for the most part, this was the fastest death when it came to the ancient torturous execution styles. So this method became the most common during the 18th century in France and lasted till the 20th. And it actually became a symbol of the revolution and the reason for equality before the law. It was meant to show that everyone, regardless of social class, received the same punishment for their crimes. So, like I mentioned before, there might have been the judge might have been like, hey, you're of high class. Maybe we could do a negotiation. That did not happen when it came to this. And we see this when King Louis of France is executed in the guillotine. And a lot more people, but he was the most famous death in the guillotine. He was executed for charges of treason and crimes against the state. Here's the picture. King Louis dead by the guillotine. So he was charged with charges of treason and crimes against the state. Due to his death, the guillotine is why I said became the symbol of French Revolution. And out of all the ancient executions, this would have been considered one of the more humane ones among the ancient methods. The other ones were known for them to be torture beforehand and be humiliating as well. This one was in public. They were all in public deaths, but this one was the fastest. Unlike the ancient methods of execution that were physically and mentally painful, lethal injections is the form of execution used currently, among a few others. And today we try to minimize the suffering and unnecessary cruelty that the other ancient executions were all about. So lethal injections, it works as a drug dose that causes death, obviously. And the first step, once it is injected, is it eliminates pain perceptors. So you don't know, you're sedated. And then it goes to a paralytic. You get paralyzed, you can't move. Finally, the person gets cardiac arrest and dies. Usually this person is dead in 5 minutes. The process is from 5 minutes to 7. And the first lethal injection execution was actually Charles Brooke, is this man right here on the screen. He was charged with kidnapping and murder. And he was the first one to have an execution by lethal injection. Lastly, there is one last form of execution that causes a little bit of controversy on whether it is too cruel or not. This is the electric chair method. Some people argue that the intense pain and suffering caused by electrocution make it an inhumane method of execution. There have also been some incidents where the electricity was not enough and it didn't kill the person. So then, as you can see in this picture, the doctors have to come make sure that the person is dead. If they are not, this is when it becomes a little more torturous, and they have to electrocute the person again until they die. And in this way, it isn't really an immediate death. But now some might also say that this method of execution spreads a strong message against crime. But in my opinion, back then, if the skinning, if the brazen bull, if the hanging, if the guillotine, if the crucifixion, if those didn't make people get the strong message of no more crimes, I don't think electric chair is going to. But everyone has their own opinions. I'm sure they all send a message, but it's a process with the whole execution things. In conclusion, all methods of execution have changed throughout history, showing how the societal attitude change within time and how legal considerations change as well. And the ancient methods like crucifixion and brazen bull were often known by their brutality, their gruesomeness, and their public displays, most of it. And over time, though, society has changed these gruesome methods, these humiliating methods, into more humane and rightful punishments. Because honestly, stealing and then you're executed, I don't really think that's very fair. But now, modern methods of execution, such as lethal injection and the electric chair, have been have been made with the goal of minimizing unnecessary pain. However, even though the methods of execution formed today have their controversies and legal challenges, including speculations about executions gone wrong, drug availability, and legal considerations. So, by executions gone wrong causing speculations, is what I had mentioned earlier, saying about the electric chair that sometimes, maybe people, everyone's different. Some people need more electricity to die. And sometimes it is not enough, the volts are not enough for that person to die, or they didn't keep it for long enough. And the doctor comes, the person is not dead, and they have to do it again. And it kind of beats the point of the whole no more ancient times torturous execution methods. But yeah, therefore, it will be really rare for all of society to always be content with a method of execution being used, on who it's being used and why it's being used, because I'm sure there's a lot of people that were against a lot of executions, whether it was because they thought the person was innocent, whether it was because they didn't think they deserved it, whether it's because they don't think that what they did, kind of coincides with the execution. They think it's too much, but nobody's ever really going to be, all happiness together. Everyone's right. Everyone has the same opinion. So this over here is just a little picture of just comparing how ancient times used to be, guillotine, fast, and I mean that was one of the good ones, versus now the lethal injection, which is just you get sedated, paralyzed, you die. Like you don't really, what's happening, but you're always gonna know what's happening. But yeah, these are the references that I used, some of the references that I used. And that's the end of my midterm presentation. Thank you guys for listening. Bye-bye.